All right, I will call the Provo City Planning Commission hearing for Wednesday, June 24th, 2020 to order. It is 6:01 p.m. We have 3 items on the agenda tonight. 2 are related. Those items that have an asterisk are legislative in nature and will be making a recommendation to municipal council on those items. The items that do not have an asterisk are administrative, and the Planning Commission will actually make a ruling on those items. So to kick off, I would like to ask the commissioners to state their name for the record and whether they have a conflict of interest with any items on the agenda. And I can call your names out to make things easier. So Mr. Knudsen?
Robert Knudsen, no conflict of interest.
Thank you. Ms. Jensen?
Lisa Jensen, no conflict.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips?
Russell Phillips, no conflicts.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson? Mr. Anderson?
Maybe he has a conflict.
I could come back to him. Ms. Winden?
Maria Winden, no conflicts.
Thank you. Mr. Phillips? Oh, I already called you. I'm sorry. Ms. Urquiaga?
Laurie Urquiaga, no conflicts.
Thank you. Deborah Jensen, no conflicts. And Mr. Anderson? He may have stepped away for a moment. But he has not informed me of any conflicts, and he is present on the call.
He actually is there on the video, and it looks like he's just having audio problems. Nod your head if you have no conflicts.
All right, no conflicts. Super, thank you. All right, item 1 this evening. The Community and Neighborhood Services Department requests an ordinance text amendment to Provo City Code Sections 14.06.020 and 14.34.060 to add a definition for utility trailer and provide clarification on the location of boats, boat trailers, and travel trailers in residential zones. This will have citywide application, and Mr. Scott Johnson will present item 1.
Thank you. As I was introduced, my name is Scott Johnson. I've worked for Provo City in the Community and Neighborhood Services Department for a little over 4 years now. My job as a code compliance officer is to enforce the zoning code as it's written and adopted by the City Council. All right, so section 14.34.060, location of boats, boat trailers, and travel trailers, is a section of code that was adopted by the City Council in the 1970s. It's been on our books since the 1970s and has not changed since that time. Our proposal today is in an effort to get a little more clarification and equitable enforcement on different types of trailers that we see throughout the city. Since this section of code was adopted, many different types of trailers have come into market, and we see them parked in locations where this code doesn't allow for boats and boat trailers, but various utility type trailers we see parked in front yard areas as this code disallows. And when we go and enforce in neighborhoods for properties that have boats and boat trailers parked in their front yard area, we see properties adjacent to them or just down the road that have similar size trailers parked on their lot in the front yard area, but our code doesn't allow us to enforce on those items. So in proposing this, we're looking for just simply to get some understanding on how we can best be equitable in our enforcement of trailers across the board throughout the city of Provo. I'm going to go through a few examples First are some examples of what our current code on the books does not allow. So we see here a boat on a boat trailer and a travel trailer, both parked in the front yard area. As the code is written, parking them in your front yard area includes the driveway. And so these are instances where our code would require us as code enforcement officers to enforce on these property owners to move these to a location that's not in their front yard. So it'd be on the side yard, the rear yard, or completely remove it from the property. Here are some examples of different utility trailers that are located in the same neighborhood as the two previous examples. These are trailers that our code would not allow us to enforce on. If the city were to adopt what is being proposed today, these are trailers that our code would also allow code enforcement officers to enforce on, to require being in the same location that the code currently requires boats and boat trailers and travel trailers. Now, in addition, in the same neighborhood, we often find, I don't know if often would be the appropriate word, but occasionally we find properties that have various trailers on the same lot. You'll see here there's a utility trailer and a travel trailer and a utility trailer. All of these are parked in the front yard area on the driveway. Our code would require us to go and tell the property owner that they have to move their travel trailer, but it would allow them to maintain the utility trailer park where it is. So our amendment that's being proposed today is to include all these types of utility trailers so that we can provide a more equitable enforcement throughout the city on various types of trailers. As a staff, we feel that potentially the bigger question that needs to be addressed is how big of a concern does the city have with boats and boat trailers being parked on what would otherwise be considered a legal parking space on a property. If, as a planning commission, or if the city council feels that the way the code is written, we should continue to enforce on boats and boat trailers parked in the front yard area, we feel it appropriate to adopt this proposal to include utility trailers for a more equitable enforcement of trailers throughout the city. If both trailers and travel trailers parked on the driveway in a front yard area is not a concern, then we feel a better approach may be to amend the code a different way to allow for boats and boat trailers to be parked on the driveway in the front yard area. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you. And commissioners, if we want to try the raise your hand button at the bottom of the attendee list, and then I can call on you. Ms. Jensen?
It may come as a surprise that I have a question. Initially, when I read through this, I thought this is a fantastic thing. I love that they do this. But then I started walking around my neighborhood and realized that nearly every house has a violation of this. And if this isn't already being enforced without neighbors ratting on each other, we have a huge number of people who are in violation just with the recreational vehicle trailer rule. And if we add the other trailers to it, we're going to have a nightmare on our hands. And then I started thinking, what really is our legal justification for this rule? Are we just saying we want our city to be neat? Is it a safety issue? Is it what is when it was put on the books back when it was? Like, I get that aesthetically it's junky to have abandoned cars and unused RVs and whatever sitting around, but some people do it well and some people don't. But I've seen people do it well and not comply with the ordinance. So I'm just wondering if you maybe know the history of why this came to be on the books and how we can meet the same intent without creating an enforcement nightmare.
I don't know the intent behind it. As I did my research and the history of it, it looked like it was 1974 when it was first adopted. That was before I was born, so I was not born in Utah. So there's 2 strikes against me being able to know the history behind it. I really don't know
I think that
the intent behind it.
I think that lots of zoning codes in different cities have something similar to this. There was kind of a general idea back about that time period that our cities should look a certain way, and if you have those types of trailers or boats or things like that, the consensus at that time was kind of like, well, you can have them, but put them in the backyard. In the convening 45 years that have passed since that time, I think the proliferation of these toys and different utility things has, just gone way, way up. And so now the question just comes into play of, does it really matter to us if a boat is parked in the driveway or if the truck to pull it is parked in the driveway? And as far as staff, we don't necessarily care one way or the other. We just think that the same enforcement or lack thereof should be applied either way.
Right. So I totally agree that a utility trailer should be the same as one of these recreational trailers or vehicles. I think we need to back up a little bit and say we're not even enforcing the rule we already have. So doubling the number of violations is going to mean either we're creating a law that we don't have no intention of enforcing, or we have a nightmare on our hands.
Well, and I would just say our enforcement officers do the best they can, but because of proliferation,
Right.
Go to
I'm
any-
not saying someone's not doing their job. I'm just saying there are clearly, like you said, so many of them. And as I walked around this morning, these are in houses that there's no option. They would have to either get rid of said utility vehicle, or they would have to pay to store it somewhere, which the whole reason they have it is because they're scraping by doing their own, like in many cases, it's not because it's an extra leisurely thing. It's because it's their livelihood. And I just don't know how to enforce that without creating a huge nightmare. Although I do love what it accomplishes aesthetically. My second part of that is there's police ordinances that say you can't park your car on the street for more than 3 days, right? Those aren't zoning ordinances.
Right, yeah, that's the police that enforce that.
So, if we could just figure out how to enforce that one more consistently, then the ones on the driveway aren't as much of a headache. Like the picture that's on the screen right now with the utility vehicle that's parked in the street. Anyway, those were my concerns, and they're not really necessarily answerable, but I feel like we need to be very careful that we don't create a bigger nightmare or something that's unenforceable.
And just kind of going off that, Ms. Jensen, I would also add that I would also encourage you to consider the fact that if you amend the code to allow these types of uses in the driveway area of the front yard and whatever, the likelihood that you would see more cars on the street would probably go up.
Yeah.
And so that's just a consideration. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a different discussion, but it's just something to consider.
So is your enforcement mechanism still relying wholly on people to report their neighbors that have these violations?
That's a large majority, but when we have a property that we see that we have a complaint on, we go out and look at that property. We also look around at adjacent properties within view to see if other properties have the same issue, and so that we can enforce fairly across the board. We don't want to just pick out one neighbor. Well, they're the ones that got complained on. We don't care about anyone else. We want to be fair.
Good. Okay. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Urquiaga.
My question is, Scott, what proportion of the enforcement actions you get reported are for working vehicles versus recreational vehicles? Do you have a sense of that?
Meaning the recreational trailers?
Well, I'm thinking like somebody who has a trailer that has their landscaping business in their trailer versus somebody who has a boat. If you can tell, do you have a sense of how much of it is? Because I really hate to interfere with people's businesses.
Yeah,
Although it does allow things to be parked overnight. So I guess if they were to move it every day and bring it back overnight, it would still be in compliance with the code, right?
Yes, that would. To answer your question, I'm not sure that I have any information on how many complaints we get on utility type trailers versus travel trailers. When we do receive complaints on utility trailers, generally those are deemed unfounded because our section of code does not address utility trailers. And so the case is just fairly quickly closed and we move on to other cases.
Okay.
Ms. Wyndon?
So at first my thoughts were going along the lines of Ms. Jensen, that on the surface, this seems more of an aesthetic code. But as I got to thinking more deeply about it, and as Provo faces growing pains and people are allowed to, different areas of Provo have supplemental overlays or accessory A overlays in different areas of Provo, and we're allowed to rent out portions of our home, thus having more vehicles parked on a property. I began to think that, if this code were done away with and people could legally park boats and utility trailers and RVs in their driveways, then where are they going to park their vehicles? And if they rent out part of their home legally, where are the renters going to park as well? And, if you have a whole neighborhood that is allowed to rent out part of their home, I could see areas of Provo where this could become an issue down the line, where not every homeowner has an RV, has a boat, has water ski or jet skis or utility trailers, but I could see where this could potentially become an issue. So I'm not sure that it's a code that we want to do away with. That being said, then we need to be able to enforce equitably. And so I think we need to add utility trailers to it.
Great, thank you. Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, more comments, I guess, than any questions. This is a real easy one for me. As long as it's legal to travel on the road, so it has whatever registrations things might require, as long as it doesn't hang over the sidewalk, so into the right of way. And if we really wanted to be particular, maybe even to require a couple of feet or something set back away from the sidewalk, just to make sure that there's no interference with, that part of the neighborhood. I think the current regulation is a pretty significant overreach in terms of telling people they can and can't park on their property. But I do think probably it's appropriate to have a limit. So for me, maybe even just one boat trailer, utility trailer, recreational trailer, whatever it might be, on a property, having that kind of limit, or at least allowing only one to be parked in the front setback. I'd be game for that. But otherwise, I don't know why a community would want to interfere with how people live to the degree that we are in telling people what they can't park in the front setback, where it's otherwise legally parked.
Great. I would add to that I agree that it would be wise to limit the number of trailers, campers, boats that can be parked in the front yard on the driveway. rather than some of these examples show 2 plus a pickup truck, or 2 in the driveway and then another one out in front. I'm presuming, and I guess this is a question, that leaving boats parked on the street overnight is a police matter. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, our parking enforcement addresses those types of issues.
And my observation is that that's not enforced either, because we have people in my neighborhood that have huge boats that really hamper visibility at intersections, and they're parked there 24/7. So, and RVs. Sometimes the RVs even have power cords going out to them. So I presume somebody's sleeping out there. So, you know I've said this in the past, but I think a lot of the regulations we have, it's fine to have the regulations, but unless they're enforced, and many of them, such as this, are not adequately enforced. But I think visually for the community, it's better not to allow things like these to be parked in the front of a house. If you can't get it to your backyard down a side drive or in some other way, then many municipalities do require they be stored in a secured facility off-site. So they have to go rent a storage space. There's lots of them around. People aren't going to do that unless they have to. But certainly, I would not be in agreement to have more than one on a property. And I agree with Ms. Winden also that the utility trailer should be included in that.
You had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there a code? I was watching the news one evening. They were talking about these doctors and nurses who were involved with the COVID, and they didn't want to infect their families. So they went out and they rented trailers and put the trailer on their property so they could live in that and they would not infect their wife or children. Is there a law in Provo about that type of people actually living in the trailers?
I'm not aware of any section of the code that addresses that directly.
Any other questions for staff, commissioners?
Just a quick question, just to follow
Just
up.
one more.
Ms. Winden?
Just to follow up on what was just asked. In that sort of situation where there's a healthcare professional and he's working with COVID patients, would there not be an exception able to be granted in that sort of situation?
Well, we don't have anything in our code that addresses somebody living in the trailer on their property. Our code just simply addresses where it's located on the property. So if somebody's decides to sleep for a few weeks because of COVID-19 in their travel trailer on the side yard or in the rear yard of the property, there's nothing in our code that allows us to enforce on that.
Except for it does say 7-day limit.
In the front yard,
In the front yard.
if it's owned by a bona fide guest of the property. And so if it's their own property and they, for example, a mother doesn't want to affect their children or their spouse because of working in the healthcare industry, they want to stay in the trailer for, while they're concerned about the COVID-19. As long as it's parked on the side of the property, our code doesn't address that as a concern or any issue.
Since motorhomes are motorized, are they not part of this code either?
I believe motorhome does fit within the definition of travel trailer.
Any other questions for staff, commissioners?
I have a couple of comments. I agree with Dave that I think that legal vehicles ought to be able to be parked in legal parking places. But I would be opposed to having a bunch of them in a driveway. So I think limited to one being legal, I could support. I would like to see the enforcement focus on the vehicles that are in the roadway, because those are an impediment to drivers, and they're a visibility issue. If you've got a neighborhood with children who go running in and out of things and you can't see them, they come shooting out from behind a trailer. It's a huge danger. So I think the vehicles in the road are both an eyesore and a health risk, a physical safety risk. But in the driveway, if it is off the sidewalk and tucked back, that doesn't bother me. And I guess that's my comment. I do think that it needs to be enforced fairly, and all the vehicles need to have the same treatment.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, did you have another comment?
I had a question for staff. I'm not familiar with a lot of communities in our part of the world that disallow people from parking these types of trailers in the driveway in front of the home, for example. Do you guys know of any other communities that do, maybe Utah County communities?
Payson City. I mean, just off the top of my head, that was one that was not allowed there.
Off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any other.
Not allowed in Sandy. You have to be behind the front setback. Dave, I don't know if you have more follow-up to your question, but just a comment. I'm going to play devil's advocate here for just 1 second and say, allowing one to be parked opens up a whole nother situation of enforcement, because now you have to patrol and say, oh, well, those people have two parked in their driveway, and what really is the justification of only, if you're going to allow one, what's really the justification of only allowing one versus two? Or I just want to throw that out there to say, I can see for limiting it to one, but I can also see some issues with that.
I guess just kind of trying to look at it practically. If somebody wanted to put 4 in a front setback, I think the neighborhood does start to look like a storage yard or something like that. If somebody wants to have a nice boat or a nice fifth wheel, that somehow into the front, setback, I'd hate for them to have to move to another community to be able to have that type of a opportunity, asset, different things like that. And I feel the same way about, work related vehicles. Boy, I guess I have concerns about any community that's willing to staff itself to regulate its own citizens to the degree that I feel like Provo does. So generally speaking, I'm in favor of less regulation, but again, just as a practical matter, it seems like there probably is some point at which this does become a problem. I certainly don't think 1 or 2, again, if they're not just permanent storage, and that can be proved because, they're operational, they're registered or something like that, then I think, frankly, if Provo really, really enforce this across the board uniformly, there probably would be a realization pretty quickly that it's not a very practical rule to enforce the way it's written today. Certainly not by adding utility trailers to it. That's just my opinion, but.
And again, one more thing to keep in mind, that these, all of these trailers or whatever, or vehicles for that matter, still have to actually be parked on legal parking spots, meaning a driveway area that's leading to covered parking. You can't just go into the front setback of your yard and park a trailer. It actually has to be on a legal parking spot.
All right, commissioners, any other questions before we open this up for public comment?
I have one last question.
Yes, Ms. Wyndham.
A question for staff. As you've gone out on these sorts of enforcement issues, in your experience, how many of these boats and trailers can you tell have just been allowed just to sit there and are not currently being used by the resident? It's just their driveway is more or less their storage yard, versus they're actively being used. They use their boats on the weekends. They use their campers on the weekends or during the summer. How many people are just using the driveway as storage versus how many people are actively using their toys?
That one's a harder one to determine. I mean, if it has flat tires and a bunch of leaves around the tires, that would be easier to tell that it's just been stored there. I don't recall seeing very many of those. I'm sure if we looked hard enough through the city, we could find a handful of them. But from my experience, most of them look to be legal operable trailers.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments for staff, commissioners? All right, we'll move on to public comment then. We did receive several letters and emails from the public on this item, and the commissioners have had access to those in advance and have reviewed them. So we do not need those repeated, but if you would like to participate this evening, you can call in comments at this time for this item. And if you're waiting to hear on any of the other items coming up this evening, we'll be participating, or we'll be opening up to public comment in the same way. We'll put this notice up on the screen with the directions on how to call in. So we'll just wait and see if we have any calls on this item. Again, we did receive several emails and communications on it from the public.
Hi, my name is Becky Bogdan, and I'm the Lakewood Neighborhood Chair. I appreciate the comments and discussion today because that's been a lot of the comments that we have seen. That's a lot of the comments that the commissioners were asking that I have seen. Also, to add to that, the verbiage within the code itself, a lot of our people are finding that confusing. There's not a definition of front yard, and there's just not a whole lot of meat to that, so it leaves it open to interpretation. So if it was more specified of, a legal driveway or a legal parking spot, I think that would be appreciated, and allowing something within the front yard would be appreciated as well. A lot of them are feeling like it's interfering with their property rights. Thank you.
Thank you. The community services, I'll put the timer on you to let us know when we believe we've reached the end of the callers.
Okay. Okay, we don't have any other comments coming in for item 1.
Great, thank you very much. I will close item 1 to public comment at this time then and turn it back over to the commissioners for further discussion. Any motion they would like to make? Ms. Jensen?
I was looking at the wording in the ordinance, and I think it was Mr. Phillips maybe who said this. Would RVs be included? And I don't think that the wording implies RVs. It implies a fifth wheel. So I think if we move forward with this and approve it, that we probably want to modify that as well. Maybe say something like boats, boat trailers, RVs, travel trailers, or utility trailers may not be blah, blah, blah. Just add RV in that list of vehicles that wouldn't be allowed. Unless we don't care if they're parked there.
Thank you. I agree with the caller that the term front yard is nebulous. I think if we are going to continue this, to use this ordinance, that we need to define that more clearly to be a legal parking space such as driveway. Just front yard is not very clear, in my opinion.
I also wonder, maybe Mr. Mills, you can answer this. Is it important to say this is the intent of the ordinance in order to reduce unused vehicles sitting around, or in order to make our neighborhoods not a place of storage, or, like, is that part a normal verbiage in a code? Do we ever need to justify why we're asking for this rule?
Well, I don't think it's a necessity. It's important to, I think it helps the public understand the intent.
Right.
But again, this is already contained within a section of development standards. And so that's kind of this is just a small section in that larger section.
I just feel like I love the idea behind it. I love having standards that keep our neighborhoods looking nice. But I've lived here for 23 years and have seen one person had this enforced on them, and they built a concrete pad for their boat, and no one else has had any enforcement. And so my neighborhood is just sprinkled with these vehicles where for such a long time they've been living like this, that even if we decide to up our enforcement, like I just don't know what the right thing is. I don't know, like Dave was saying, property rights versus aesthetics. I don't know that it's our business, even though I would love for it to be our business as far as the outcomes go. I'm just torn about, maybe we just say don't park on the street, then that's already a rule. So
on the enforcement front, I'll just add that we had, before some of you were on the planning commission as commissioners, we had another sort of a property rights issue. It was about fencing. And we even did some case study photographs about fencing in Provo, because there are certain areas fencing is not allowed. For example, a side yard right up to the sidewalk, or in the front of the house if it's 8 feet tall or 6 feet tall. However, there are violations of that throughout the city, and it's not enforced. So, and again,
it's not for lack of work on the enforcement part. I feel like the main problem is that we have built a code that relies on neighbors to rat on each other. And if you're like me, at some point, having a good relationship with your neighbors is more important than the aesthetics that we're trying to achieve. And then there's just some people who don't even know it's a law. So it just is a really tricky thing. Like Dave said, less is maybe better in so many situations. Anyway.
However, perhaps sometimes you don't realize something is a problem until it is. And, having, like in your neighborhood, Lisa, like you said, there are some of these camp trailers and boats sprinkled throughout your neighborhood, and it hasn't been a problem. And so nobody's called to report it. But if somebody in your neighborhood were all of a sudden to start parking 3 or 4 and then or maybe parking them all up and down the street, then maybe it becomes a problem and it starts affecting, multiple families along your street. And then it becomes something that somebody feels the need to report without anything being on the, in the city code. There's nothing that can be done, no way to enforce it unless they leave it on the street for more than 72 hours and then the police can come out. But other than
and that's happened too, but nobody wants to be that person anymore.
No. Like you said,
wants
everybody
to have that happen.
Right. Everybody wants to be, a good neighbor. And I think sometimes it's not a problem until it is. So I kind of hesitate to get rid of it.
Oh yeah, I agree. I think it needs to be there. I just don't know that having it the way it is the right way. Like, I feel like we have to find some way to take what Dave's ideas were and what the real concerns are and the enforcement issues and figure out what exactly it is we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to handle that. I don't know what the right blend is, though.
So I'm wondering about a language for this, and wondering if it would make more sense to say that one legal parking space in front of the house might be occupied by one of these kinds of vehicles, but no on-street parking is permitted. No long-term on-street parking is permitted. Is that a more specific enforceable ordinance?
Well, the street parking is already covered by code and by ordinance. So street parking provisions require that if there's a vehicle on the street, it has to be moved within 72 hours already. And so that kind of takes care of the long-term street parking situation.
Well, a question on that. If I have something in front of my house and I leave it there for 2 days, and then I move it 10 feet and I leave it there for 2 days and then I move it back, is that changing it every less than 72 hours make it legal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. But I do think that stating that one legal parking spot in the driveway could be used for some sort of vehicle. But otherwise it needs to be clear.
Madam Chair, can I?
Mr. Anderson, please.
I am afraid that this is going to go down a different rabbit hole in terms of just the question of legal parking space. But personally, if somebody wanted to do, I think one of the other commissioners hinted that this happens. I see it happen regularly, and I think it works well. Basically, if you have a 2-car garage and 2 parking spaces behind the garage, they'll pour another, 9 by 20 pad of concrete next to the driveway then and create a pad for a boat or a trailer or something like that. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that makes any situation any worse. That keeps the parking, behind, for example, the garage open for cars. I think that's entirely appropriate as well. If people wanted to do that, it sounds like that would require a change in terms of how we view, what's legal in terms of parking and not, but that's just another thought.
Thank you. And I have seen examples of that in my neighborhood, for example. And I think it was Mr. Mills said that some communities here require that it be parked back of the setback. So they've poured a pad and they back around their driveway, and it's back of the front of the house. So it's not sitting out there on the street. It's back along the facade of the house.
Which I think is what.
But isn't that the intent of the of what we have right now in the code.
That's my
Yeah,
understanding. Yeah.
that's hurting.
So I was referring to the idea that somebody would simply pour a pad, beside the existing driveway and park something there.
Yeah.
Which
So-
I don't think that's a problem at all, personally.
And Mr. Anderson, you're exactly right. If that's something that the council and the planning commission would want to do, that would require a little bit of code tweaking, but we could work on that.
And they'd be required to have the correct amount of setback still from a vehicle parked along a property line like that?
Currently, the way our code reads is that in order to park in the front setback, park any vehicle in the front setback, that driveway area or that legal parking space has to lead to covered parking. So what Mr. Anderson is describing currently isn't permitted by our code because the actual parking space would have to be like what you described, Ms. Jensen, where it's actually kind of in line with the house. So it's actually behind the setback.
Right.
In order to do what Mr. Anderson is talking about, we'd have to tweak that a little bit. And that's something that we could look into, but that just comes down to, is that what the planning commission wants and ultimately what the city council wants?
So if the parking is behind the front facade of the house, it doesn't have to be covered. But if it's in front of the front facade of the house, it has to lead to a carport or a garage at this point, the way the ordinance is worded.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So here's a question, and I think maybe Mr. Mills, you alluded to this earlier. If we say you can have one vehicle and it's okay now for it to be parked in front of the front facade of the house, then what about a work trailer that comes and goes? At some point, he has 2 trailers there, but the work trailer disappears during the day. So is he in violation, or does that need to be his one trailer? Or, that's where we get into gray area. Oh, well, I was going to use that one to pick up the debris at my construction site, and this other one has my tools in it, and that's my boat. But the 2 of them I take with me to work every day. So there's only one that's there 24/7. Like, how do we, I think maybe that's where Scott was saying it was an enforcement issue, where how do you keep track of which one's been there and which one's new and how long they've been there? And I don't know. I feel like putting a number to it might complicate things for that reason.
And I have another complication to add.
Bring it on.
Okay. A lot of older homes, their garages or carports were added later and are already, sometimes they're already too close to the setback. They already violate setbacks according to code. So there really is no room for them to add an additional parking pad for a jet ski trailer, a boat trailer, what have you, without going right up to the property line. So I've seen in some instances where people have needed additional parking, they've actually encroached into instead of going towards the property line, they've gone into the center of their yard. So they go more to the center, towards the front door, if you will, to create additional parking just for cars, not even talking about like boats and trailers and things. So how would you approach that in fine-tuning the language of the code?
It would take some work.
I told you I had an additional complication for you.
Probably more than what we would want to do tonight. Yes.
We already have a requirement that a limit on how much paving can be in front.
Yeah, and Ms. Walls is here with us, and she brought up a good point that we do have requirements as far as how much of your yard you can actually pave, how that pavement is treated as far as hardscape versus actual parking area, those types of things. So we have things that would regulate that, but I think it kind of leads overarching discussion that we're all having, that enforcement of this is really hard.
Yeah.
And there's not a real easy answer to this one. So it just kind of depends on which avenue you want to take. If you like the idea of having these regulated, if you like the idea of having a code that says, no, we are not allowing these types of vehicles in the front yard setback, then the recommendation is probably then add this definition so we can be equitable across the board. If it's something that you feel is, given today's current situation and the limited amount of space that people have on their properties, that it no longer becomes that big of an aesthetic issue or whatever, then my recommendation personally would be to eliminate it. I mean, as far as saying they can be anywhere on a legal parking spot. From an enforcement standpoint, and I'll defer to my colleagues who actually do this, but to me it would seem like you either go one way or the other. Splitting it becomes just more problematic. And now I'll shut up.
Well, I think Ms. Winden raised a valid point that if you don't have any regulation in place, then what recourse does anyone have if there is a problem?
But are we just saying that we only have rules for when someone doesn't like what's being done and then we enforce it? Or
I think the question before us is whether we want to add the definition of utility trailers to what we have now.
or if we want to scratch it all together, like Mr. Mills suggested,
Right.
or said was the alternative. Not that that was his choice, but
I would just say that if you want to go down that avenue, that it might be a good idea to continue the item and just instruct staff to come back to you with different language.
I don't think it should be scrapped. Just my opinion.
I agree with that.
like that it should still be on the book somehow, accomplishing the same similar purpose, but we got to figure out how to do it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think we need to add utility trailers so that
Absolutely. So it's consistent.
equal enforcement. But just as I stated before, a lot of times, we don't have a problem until there is a problem, but then we need something to fall back on when there is a need for enforcement. And so that's why I think that we need to have it on the books. Do we want to have staff rework the language so that somebody can legally park it in their front yard on a pad, what have you? That I don't know. I'm just saying that I think that this needs to be on the books, and that we don't scrap it, that we do need it on the books.
I think we need something, but I agree with Ms. Jensen that it is not helpful to have regulations that are non-enforceable, or either because there's just too much to do or because we want to ignore it. That seems to
Or
be
selective enforcement is what we have to defer to if we decide we're going to approve this tonight, because there's no way everybody who's a violator can ever be in compliance without moving out of our city, like Mr. Anderson said.
I'm kind of feeling like continuance might be a good idea.
But what are we continuing it for? Like what can they bring back to us that will fix it?
Maybe a definition that defines or adds RVs to the language, and a definition of what front yard is exactly for, in terms of this ordinance?
What
And
illegal?
a legal parking spot too.
And the vehicle would need to be legally licensed
Yes.
to be
I
parked.
like that idea.
Yeah.
And it also needs to be safe for the neighbors. For example, this snowmobile trailer that we have a picture of is halfway into the sidewalk, into the city sidewalk. So we're blocking the view there.
So it needs to be completely clear of the right of way, including sidewalks.
So in that case, that trailer would be enforced because it can't meet the new regulations that we're suggesting.
I'll say though, just to interject, we cannot regulate the licensing of a vehicle. That's Department of Motor Vehicles.
Can
So
the code
You
say,
have the legal right to have a non-licensed vehicle on your property.
It just can't be in the street, right?
Correct. If it's single axle. I
Ms.
think.
Urquioga, did you have a comment?
well,
So
I
some
was just,
trailers don't have to be licensed.
it may not work because of what Mr. Mills just said, but I could see non-licensed vehicles being in a garage or in a backyard, but not permitted in the front area. So if it were in the front area, it would need to be licensed. Is that something that is enforceable or determinable even? I'm kind of questioning how this could be put together, but I don't like selective enforcement.
I'm kind of thinking like if you're restoring an old car, you know, you can have that in your driveway or your carport, and it's not, most likely it's not, the registration isn't up to date.
Right.
Not until you get it fully restored and are driving it. And so that's perfectly legal to have that on your property.
Mr. Mills, isn't there a regulation about how many non-working vehicles you can have to prevent people from having a whole bunch of junk cars on their property?
Yes, there is. So our code defines an inoperable vehicle being, so for it to be operable, it has to be licensed, insured, and in working order. And our code requires that any inoperable vehicle be, so a maximum of 2 can be located behind a screen fence or within an enclosed structure.
Okay, so what Miss Winden just said would fall under that if it's not licensed and being renovated, it can't be on your driveway.
Right.
Interesting.
Another level.
We can provide you more hurdles if you'd like.
That's okay.
Well, just one more question. I'm looking at the second photograph on page 7 packet, and there's a beautiful camping trailer there. Looks fully functional, but it's parked so close. Yeah.
Is this the one you're talking about?
Yes. It's parked so close to the sidewalk that anybody backing out of that driveway would have to back all the way out onto the sidewalk to be able to see to their right. And if there were any children, anybody walking down that sidewalk, they would have to stop for the car. The car would not be able to see them first. And so what Mr. Anderson was saying about setbacks and all of that, that trailer, even though it fits in the driveway, it impedes the view of anybody coming out of that driveway. But if it were parked on the side, it wouldn't. That looks like there's a fence or something there. I can't tell in the photograph, but it looks like there's something there on the side of the house.
Yeah, I believe there's a fence along here.
Yeah, right there. But if the trailer were parked on the side of the house, it would provide more of a setback and more clearance for anybody driving into and out of that driveway.
Right.
If the code were changed to allow them to park in the front of their property.
But what's the difference between that giant trailer and a big 11-passenger van parked in the same exact location? The visibility would still be poor, and technically that's not illegal to have a vehicle parked that close to the sidewalk. So
It's not,
I'm not saying your observation's wrong. I'm just like throwing out
right.
problems that we would still have even without a trailer or RV in the picture. That there could still be a vehicle that large parked there.
Well, I like his last example as well on page 10. The very last one shows a very large utility trailer. This is things that are not enforceable. They have porta pad next to the driveway, so their driveway is still clear. But because it's not called out as a utility trailer, we don't have that in the code. They can't enforce it if they violate. So,
Right. And it looks like it's fairly close to the house next door. I can't tell what the setback is, but just looking at the red wall and roof line.
Yeah, so this is the house that it's parked in front of.
No, sorry, not that picture.
Not this picture. Oh,
the lower right corner.
The lower right corner.
oh, this one?
Yeah. So if you look at the wall just above the utility trailer, that looks like it's the house next door.
I believe that is.
I think the concrete pad goes right up to the property line.
Looks like it.
It looks like it does.
Are there rules on, I think somebody asked this before and I don't know if you answered it. Are there rules on how close to the property line you can pour a concrete pad? Can you go right up to the property line and park right up to the property line?
My understanding is that you can.
Okay.
On one side of your property.
That you
I would not be a happy homeowner if somebody did that on my property.
Well, I'm thinking too, there's some development in my neighborhood that has 0 lot line on one side. So if you parked yours right up to the property line, that's basically in somebody's kitchen window. Yeah. So I see some loopholes people could make people very angry with.
But the placement of those homes, they're very close together. And
yeah.
So, you know, in order for that trailer to be, you know, parked off to the side and to the back, it has to be close to the other home.
But honestly, I would rather have it parked where it is in this photo than have it be 20 feet back behind the facade of the house, because then it would be in my bedroom window. So in that sense, what we're suggesting is actually more neighborly. It's ugly, but it's not in my window.
Right.
These photos are all in my neighborhood, so I'm laughing because I know where they all are. I'm like, oh yeah, I saw that this morning.
Classic. So commissioners, what do you think you would like to do? Continue this? Approve it?
I would be in favor of continuing and having staff come back with maybe some recommendations for language in the code that would define some things that aren't currently defined.
So from some of the items that we discussed earlier.
Yes.
Ms. Urquiaga, do we also want them to come back with a better idea of how it's going to be enforced fairly? Or is that going to be more like what Ms. Jensen said, that it's just if it's a problem?
I would like to know if there's anybody who has a system that actually works. I don't know if surveying the other communities in Utah County, northern Utah would make sense to see what the options are out there, but I would like it to have something that is more fairly enforceable. I don't like requiring neighbors to basically rat on each other, as you said earlier, as the enforcement mechanism, but I don't know. I can't make a recommendation, but I wonder if anybody has a system that is working.
I've wondered before, Scott, maybe you know this. Why is it possible for the city departments to work better within each other? I've thought of all the times I see police officers driving up and down my street, and they would be able to visibly verify, hey, that's a problem there. And is there some way that while they're just driving the beat that they could record things like this so that there's more of a, there's a utility worker working on the storm drain and he notices that there's a vehicle with a flat tire and he can just somehow enter it in on a database somewhere that everyone has access to that you guys can pull your enforcement reports from? Or is that too complicated?
So we get complaints from various agencies within the city as well as neighborhoods and neighbors in general. So I think in general it's a matter of how high on the importance list is it in enforcement. Is a police officer really going to be concerned about like this trailer parked right here?
Right.
No, he's not going to be that concerned about it unless he knows specifically that's a violation and has heartache himself over it. Then he'll address it with us. We'll open a case and go investigate.
So never.
But the white one on the left side of that screen is actually extending into the sidewalk.
Yeah, that's a problem.
That is, and so I mean that's something that we as zoning, when we see things like that, we try to address that with the parking enforcement.
What you referred to, Commissioner Jensen, I think is a good reason to have code enforcement in the police department. There are other communities that do that, and it eliminates the issue you just described. Yeah, or just that lack of coordination and so forth, and redundancy.
Yeah. Well, should we make a motion to continue this?
I think if you make a motion to continue, just add your specific instructions to staff so they know what we want to see when it comes back to us. Things like the maybe case study of how other communities utilize this kind of code, how they enforce it, some of the definitions we thought were needed.
I'll make a motion.
Ms. Winden.
I move that we continue item number 1. The Community and Neighborhood Services Department requests an ordinance text amendment to Provo City Code Sections 14.06.020 and 14.34.060 to add a definition for utility trailer, and I'm going to add RV, and provide clarification on the location of boats, boat trailers, and travel trailers in residential zones, including further clarification of what is meant by front yard and whether having one of these vehicles will be permitted in a front yard area, including an additional parking pad alongside a driveway. Do I need to add anything else?
Maybe define what a legal parking spot is.
That's actually already defined in our code.
So explore maybe a different definition for legal parking space. Maybe is my thought.
Okay.
And I like the idea of case studies of other similarly situated communities.
Best practices based on case studies.
Okay.
Perfect.
Regarding enforcement or just how to write
And
code?
regulation.
Okay. Now we made it all messed up for you.
I think it's fine.
Do I need to say all that, or can that just be included?
I think that is all just fine for your motion.
Okay.
So
I
do
will
we have a
second.
sorry?
I will second.
Seconded by Ms. Urquiaga. All those in favor of continuing item 1 until staff comes back with the items we've requested in the motion? I'll go with the roll call. Mr. Knudsen?
Aye.
Ms. Jensen?
Aye.
Mr. Phillips?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Ms. Winden?
Aye.
Ms. Urquiaga?
Aye.
And Ms. Jensen, aye. So that's unanimous. We'll continue item 1. And items 2 and 3 are related, so I will read them in together. And in advance of that, I'll just state for the record also that we've received a considerable amount of email communication and other communication through staff on items 2 and 3, both pro and opposed. And commissioners have been available of all of those communications and read them in advance of this hearing. So item 2 is legislative, and we'll go to municipal council. Daniel LaFontaine requests a zone change from R110 to low density residential for 1.07 acres for a townhome development located at 50 East, 3900 North in the River Bottoms neighborhood. And item 3 is administrative. Daniel LaFontaine requests concept plan approval for 12 townhomes in a proposed low-density LDR zone located at 50 East, 3900 North in the River Bottoms neighborhood. And Mr. Ardmore will present both items 2 and 3.
Thank you. First, just a minor correction to the notice language. That didn't get corrected before the notice went out. The original plan was 12, now it's 10. So we'll see that through the presentation. And as this is the third time that we're looking at this, I won't go as deep into the history and all the different reasons for continuances we've had, but just kind of show what has changed, if that's okay. So here's the area that's being proposed for a zone change to the LDR zone. Here's what the most recent concept site plan looks like to go with that zone change request. I think as we zoom in on it, you can see some of the major differences right away, but I thought it would be more helpful to go and do the side-by-side comparison of what we had last time in front of the Planning Commission and what we have now. So before we had 12 units, if you remember, half of the front doors faced a wall on the south. We had very limited open space. It was trying to fit too much in staff's opinion and Planning Commission's opinion on the prior submittal. On this new revision, we've reduced down to 10 units, so we took 2 away, or the applicant took 2 away. He's parked 25 stalls for 10 units, so that's a 2.5 per. He's masked his open space in this area in the southwest corner of the property, as well as he's got green spaces all around the frontages on the streets. And now he's satisfied that design requirement about having the majority of the units face the street. So he's got 4 fronting on the 70 East and 2 fronting on the 3900 North. Let's see, we've got some elevations here, just some conceptual renderings of what it would look like, this being 3900 North. So you could see the two units there facing 3900 North, the access into the garages on these other units, and here's those units off of 70 East. So he's brought the doorsteps down. He's attempted to make the architecture more in line with neighborhood, single-family housing style. He's got gables on there and different architectural elements to try to make that blend in. So staff's recommendation here, as you read in your packets, we feel like the only way to move the LDR zone forward with a positive recommendation is if we could tie up these 10 units rather than what's possible in the LDR zone with some sort of development agreement or other type of binding instrument. Also wanted to note that this is a concept plan at this point, as is required with the zone change. If the zone got approved by the city council, the applicant would have to come back with project plan approval and meet all the LDR zone requirements, including design regulations and standards. And the staff would work with the applicant on those issues. But we feel at this time that we should move the application to the city council so the applicant can have a decision on whether to move forward with his plans or not. So that's kind of where our recommendations lie. Let me make sure I covered everything I wanted to. As you mentioned, we did get numerous emails, a lot of them just about the density and open space. I'm sure you'll hear from some of those people tonight, but I'm open to any questions if you have them for me now.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, questions for Mr. Ardmore?
Madam Chair,
Mr. Anderson?
has the applicant expressed any hesitation with entering into a development agreement relative to this concept plan and the zone change?
Are you talking to me or Mr. Ardmore?
Ardmore.
For Mr. Ardmore at this time.
Okay, sorry.
I spoke with the applicant prior to this meeting after the staff report went out, expressed to him that that's one option that the Planning Commission could put on this as a condition, but that in the end is the Planning Commission and the City Council's call. But Mr. LaFontaine didn't seem opposed to that being an option, but those are things that he would have to proffer, of course.
If he were to offer that, would that change staff's recommendation?
Yes. So if there's a development agreement tying it down to the 10 units and the site plan as shown and things like that, staff would be more supportive of the zone change.
And then my last question, just in terms of process, I should know this, but still fuzzy. This would come back to the Planning Commission for project plan approval. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So if we felt like there were maybe some tweaks that were appropriate to make state of the architecture or something like that, would we have the purview the next time we see it to require things that way?
Right. And the project plan would also be in front of the design review committee. So it's another step towards that if the zone change is approved.
Perfect. Thanks.
Commissioners, any other questions for staff? I have one question that I saw expressed by, I think it was Ms. Urquiaga, about what the VLDR zoning, whether that's been adopted and is in place, and whether that would be an option for this property, and if that would alleviate any of the concerns in terms of the number of units that could be constructed on the site.
Sure, I could address that. The VLDR, the very low density residential zone, was adopted last week by City Council. The maximum density on that is 7 units per acre, where the current concept plan Mr. LaFontaine has shown is 10 units per acre. So the current layout wouldn't work with the VLDR.
And does it have different design regulations as well?
No, they point to the same design regulations.
Great, thank you. Any other
I have
questions?
a question. I
Yes,
have one.
Jensen.
On page 3 of the staff report, Mr. Ardmore, it says, item B, staff feels that there are reasons to deny this request based primarily on past negotiations with various developers and the neighboring residents. What does that mean?
So there's a history that I kind of went over in the prior hearings where the specifically Canyon Cove subdivision of this neighborhood worked with applicants and worked with staff to make sure that any multifamily developments don't access onto their streets of 3900 North or 100 East. So there's kind of that expected condition from this neighborhood that would be continued. It's not in code or anything like that, but there's just that expectation that's kind of been made a tradition now.
Okay.
Any other questions for staff commissioners? Okay, seeing none at this time, I will invite the applicant, Mr. LaFontaine, to add any additional information and perhaps answer any questions that he heard.
So like Aaron, this is like the third round, and I'm not sure exactly how much of this that you guys want me to go through again. So I'll just be very brief on a few of the points. Probably the biggest point is that with our last meeting, and I'm pretty sure most all of you of the commissioners were there, but I was asked by you to have a conversation with the Community Development Committee, which I did, or not committee, the staff, and address. I saw 6 specific things that you, as commissioners, wanted me to fix. Aaron or Mr. Ardmore pretty much covered most of them, but with that request from you commissioners, I did meet with Mr. Ardmore and Mr. Pepperoni, Mr. David Day, Mr. Robert Hunter, and then the engineers at Dudley and Associates to address every issue that was brought up by you as the commissioners. And I feel like we've done that. Like Mr. Ardmore said, we went from 12 units to 10 units. We also, one of the things was making the east elevations a little more appealing. The parking issue came up again. We added more parking spaces. We did talk about the respect of the design with the neighborhood, which that's been addressed as well. And then there was like no open space or no amenities in the last plan. So since then we've added it's like 2 pickleball courts with a basketball court as well. So I think we did all that. Also, I've read through a lot of the neighbors' issues. I think a lot of those were directed towards specifics that I was told in the meeting with the community developers, that those were issues that were specific. This is a concept plan, and those are issues that we can address as we move forward. So I think I'll just not go over all the issues or rehash them, just because of you guys probably want to go home sometime tonight and see your families. So I am going to just, if it's okay, I think I can just answer your questions and maybe come back to me if there's something kind of awry with what some of the opposition, what their points are. Otherwise, I think I'll just leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Mr. LaFontaine.
Sure.
Commissioners, questions for the applicant? Mr. Anderson?
Madam Chair, yeah, just, I mean, you heard the conversation with Mr. Ardmore a minute ago, which I think is all about just your level of commitment to this particular plan and providing some assurance that this indeed is what you'd follow through with, and, you know, any subsequent property owners, what they would follow through with if the zoning is changed. Do you have any concern with working with staff just to make sure that they're comfortable about having the proper checks in place to ensure that this is what ultimately gets built?
No, I don't have any issues at all that way. And we did discuss those, and that Mr. Ardmore brought up that point that, you know, maybe if we can get something signed in writing from you, that because with this property as it is, you can do 15 units. And granted, at the beginning, I did pack them in. This design is much more appealing and workable, and it has the amenities and the open space. So if that is something that needs to be done, as far as saying, well, you know, we're going to stick with the 10 and not move it up to 12 or anything else, then I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't have any issues there.
Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions, commissioners?
I have a question.
Ms. Jensen?
On the proposed site plan on page 6 of item number 2, it shows what I understand is just a concept plan, but some of the letters that we got from neighbors were saying there wasn't enough room to park 2 cars, and to me that looks like it's a 2-car garage. So is that a concern we can quell for them?
Well, probably not. So the code requires 2.4 or 2.25. We bumped it up to 2.5. There's a possibility of putting a couple more, it's like maybe 2 or 3 more, probably 2 more parking spaces that are right there, just north of the pickleball courts. There's
on the right side.
On the right
side, the east side.
Yes, on the east side.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry, on the west side.
West side. Yeah.
On the west side.
Okay.
So it's just directly across from numbers 9 and 10. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 parking spaces there. I think there might be room for 2 more, but
oh, okay.
So that would be, you know, it's already over what is required by the city of Provo, but you know, I'm open to doing that. The only issue came is with the engineers. They said there's a possibility that you might have to have a little green space for some drainage, but they weren't entirely sure about that. That's why they drew it in the way they did.
Can the residents, I know there was a lot of questions about ingress and egress. Does this road does 100 East get out onto 3700 North?
100 East, it dumps onto 3900 North. A lot further to the east though. So
so if somebody needed to go south and they can't make a left turn at 3900 North, would they have to turn right and then go down 100 East and then come out 100 East at 3700 North? Like on the east side of Jiffy Lube?
So you mean if they wanted to go, you said if they wanted to go south?
Yes, is that the only way for them to get out of the neighborhood and go south?
Yes, technically speaking.
Okay.
Mr. LaFontaine, I'll just ask you a quick question. I mentioned the new zoning designation called VLDR, very low density residential, that was just adopted. That would restrict your property to 7 units, but it would not require a development agreement. Is that something you would be amenable to? Or does that preclude your pro forma from working for you?
Yeah, that kind of precludes the pro forma. To answer that, Ms. Jensen. The very first meeting I had with the neighborhood on this property, it was almost their sole argument was regarding traffic. And there was a lot of emotion involved in that, but very few facts. And so I met with the, actually, I don't remember who he was exactly, but it was the traffic engineer. And we crunched the numbers, pretty much a worst case scenario. And even with that, which actually the numbers got better because I took even 2 more units out. There was 928 trips per day that would still be allowable through the neighborhood. And that would be like if nobody went out on University Avenue and turned right, they all went through the neighborhood. There's still that much leeway, which is, that's quite a bit. So again, I try to stick to the facts of the matter, which is, what I've done here. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioners, any other questions for Mr. LaFontaine?
I don't know if this is a question or kind of a comment. One of the commissioners made a comment last time that the end of the units kind of looked like a barracks. That was the east facing end. Now that's facing north, but it still kind of has that same appearance. And if I were living in that neighborhood, that garage alley would really bother me. So I don't know if there's room on the plan to maybe change the orientation for a couple of the units that are on the interior floor so that they're facing north, and maybe there's not quite so much of that slot canyon look of it, because I think that is something aesthetically that many of the neighbors are objecting to. I don't know what your engineering has told you is possible, but I'd really like to see that reoriented in some way.
So, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your last name.
Urquiaga, but that's okay. You can call it Commissioner Yu.
So I did go over that with Mr. Ardmore and Mr. Pepperoni. And what I did with the 2 units, which are units 1 and 8 that face to the north, we did add some, windows, awnings. We did some batterboard and some stone. However, that being said, we could, well, the awnings aren't on there. Anyway, so we could dress that up a little bit better so it doesn't look quite so bland, but so the answer is yes. I mean, that could be something that we could put down as part of the, with the powers that be and whoever are putting together these recommendations or requirements that I need to see.
Yeah, I'd even like to see consider maybe switching it, instead of having the 2 units of 4 that are right next to each other, maybe having the 1 unit of 4 on the east, another unit of 4 facing north, more to the west, and the 2 separate units being kind of the ones in the middle rather than off to the side. I just think if you had more front facing towards 3900 North, it would be more attractive in the neighborhood. Like I said, that slot canyon just kind of puts me off. But which, going into the garages where you just got that big old wall with the garages, if I were across the street from that, I would not enjoy looking out my front windows. So if it looks to me like there's room to do something like that, but I don't know what your engineering has said. I'd like to see something like that considered.
Yeah, it's a good observation, and we did consider all those options. We looked at how to turn these, and this seems to be as far as trying to please everybody, which is, as you know, that's
Yeah, it's an impossible
but,
thing.
But I think we've done a pretty darn good job, except with the exception is I think we can maybe dress up that north end of those two numbers, units 1 and 8, a little bit better. So I could that's something that we could probably work on. Not opposed to that.
Can I maybe add something to that?
Mr. Anderson.
That was the one thing I was going to comment on. I think as far as the orientation of the garages is concerned, it seems like that's something that we had some kind of regulation that applied to in terms of not having those face the street. Or no, it was having units face green space, I think, something like that. So as I see it, I think the applicant has oriented the buildings the way that he's been directed to. I certainly, the thing that I was going to comment on relative to architecture, and this would require maybe some adaptation, but for those, it's unit 1 and 8 on the plan that we're looking at there for those two. I'd sure love to see the front doors orient out towards the street to the north. I think that would break up that otherwise pretty plain flat wall. I think it's going to take something pretty significant to make that look attractive along that street, just given kind of the mass that you have to deal with there. So that was going to be my thought on architecture.
I was going to wait until after hearing public comments, but those are, when I saw the renderings, these were exactly my thoughts. I realized that Mr. LaFontaine hasn't wanted to spend a lot of money on designs until he knew whether or not his project was going to get the green light. But based on how many times he's come before the Planning Commission and how many meetings he's had with the neighborhoods and knowing their views of his project, I must say that I was a bit surprised that there wasn't more added to the design other than just the addition of some gables and a few other things to try to really spruce up the appearance of the project. Mr. LaFontaine, is this going to be an upscale project? Or is that what you're going to try to market it as?
I'm not sure what you're considering upscale, but I can tell you that the square footage were about 3,500 feet per unit. And with the going rate, that's going to take them in at about 500,000 per unit, which is, however, there are some of those units. I mean, we could change things up to make them cheaper. And then that would fit in a little better, with the Provo City's moderate income housing plan. So again, Ms. Wyndon, it's like, who in the world can please everybody with these designs? I think we've done a pretty good job, but we could probably come back to this thing quite a,
Well, so 500,000, that's a pretty substantial piece of property. I don't think the outside matches the price tag. And I agree with my fellow commissioners with the north elevation, turning that around, making it the entrance, the front door approachable from the street. But again, I understand from previous meeting, you said that you didn't want to spend a lot of money on your renderings because you didn't know if you were going to be getting the green light or not. But I mean, I just did I've done a couple of quick searches online of upscale twin home designs and things like that. And there's some beautiful designs out there. And I'm still a little surprised that your renderings don't reflect more of that to better fit the neighborhood. Those were my comments.
Any other questions or comments for Mr. LaFontaine?
I have some.
Yes, Ms. Jensen?
So, am I correct in the assumption that the reason you have just the 2 units on that front pad is because that's the last phase where you would knock the house down and build these 2 in its place?
Partially, excuse me, partially, but the with the design before, if you were, those were there at the beginning, and then there were 2 more behind, which is where the pickleball courts are. I think I probably should look at the camera. Anyway, so that's when those got taken out, it leaves those 2 in the front. Those will be the last ones, yes.
Because the one concern I have still, these do look more like a house when you turn them around and it faces the street. The design can still be improved, but I feel like you addressed that for us. I just don't feel like it's, if our intent was to make this a buffer between the higher density to the south and the lower density to the north and east, and we're still kind of at the same density. So I wondered if you made 3 sets of 3 units, and where you've got your 2 units in the front, if that became 3 and the street went over a little further, and then you have another 3 units that's facing 3900 north. And then that last 3 units can face 100 east. And then you've kind of created a courtyard for the community. So it has a community effect where everybody accesses their house from behind, and their common space is behind. And from the street, it looks like 3 lovely big homes. I'm just wondering if maybe it would cut you down 1 more unit, but it would give you the true buffer zone, which is a slightly lower density from one and a slightly higher density from the other. And it would make it have a nicer look, I think, and a more of a community feel for the residents of your little development. Just an idea.
I think I would stick with the idea of those units 1 and 8 coming off of 3900 north. I think that could be an improvement for sure.
But it also doesn't get rid of the alleyway that you have with them both accessing from that same way. If you can have everybody access from behind, there's no alley. It becomes a plaza instead. That was just where my brain was going with that suggestion.
Okay.
And everything, because I think the neighbors would feel like you've just built 3 single family homes visually if you can put 3 or 4 units in each of the buildings and have them all face the street. But then it looks like a subdivision of 3 homes, but really there's several units in it. So I feel like it's more of a middle ground where you're saying, hey, I've created something that looks like 3 beautiful homes that would fit into your lovely neighborhood, and you've got all your parking hidden behind, so nobody feels like they can see that it's really an apartment building. I'm just trying to make it look like what they want it to look and feel like, and still give you the numbers that are close to what you want to get. That was where I was going with those ideas. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioners, any other questions for Mr. LaFontaine?
No.
Okay, if there are none, at this time, we'll open it up to public comment. And again, the instructions to dial in for public comments are shown on the screen that's up right now. And if you have sent in comments previously, we would just ask that you do not call in and repeat the same comments. We have read through all of them in detail. And I'll ask the development department to keep time on this portion of the hearing.
Okay, I have one call in from David Rosen. One moment, please. Caller 1394, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Dave Rosen, and I live in Provo, and I am the River Bottoms Neighborhood Chair. And thank you for taking the public comment this evening. I know there are many in the neighborhood that wanted to be there in person, have sent emails, or may want to give a public comment tonight. As has been mentioned, this is the third time this has come before. Each time there seems to be a little bit of give, but yet we're still not addressing the main issues here. This subdivision is one of Provo's beautiful subdivisions. It's single-family homes. There were two large parcels of ground surrounding this on the front side of University Avenue that were over many years negotiated and restricted from coming in and through this subdivision so that it may remain as a single-family home. There are single-family homes on this property, except for 5 lots that were recently developed that are still selling as single-family homes. There are multiple lots in this subdivision that are greater than just a single-family home, but yet they have single-family homes on them. So the question is this going to remain a single-family home neighborhood, or are we going to start opening it up and set a precedent where we allow single-family homes to suddenly move and metamorphose and change into multi-family homes? This neighborhood and the city is trying to maintain single-family homes. The neighbors in here feel that it's very important that we preserve our single-family home neighborhoods and that this one be preserved and that it remain as a single-family lot home. Now, there has been some willingness to give. There is a new zone. As we've seen the last 2 times, this commission has given him some very specific instructions. As I mentioned in my email and letter to you, I felt that those have not really been truly addressed, and you've raised some of those issues again. Not all the lots are facing the street. This is more in line with, if it's going to be a buffer zone, it needs to be less than the 10.2 on the south and about 6.4 on the north in Broadstone. Each of those properties all front onto the front road, and each of those properties, in addition to having communal space and open space, they each have some private space. And these lots, these units are going to be $500,000 units, but yet there is not even the width of the backyards by 10 additional feet or so, what the residents could call private space. There's none in any of these designs. That should be incorporated, and the only way that's going to is to be able to reduce this down to a buffer zone that is something in the 6 or less range. The other issue that continues to come forward is well, density has always been an issue. And the last time it was requested that this be reduced down to lower than those others before. Both of those, both Broadstone to the north and Old Ivy to the south, as they have developed these multi-units, and they have center units. Instead of, they put 3 in a row or they put 4 in a row, and the center units are extremely difficult to sell. In fact, Mr. Dester, who is the developer of Old Ivy, said he wanted as many 2-unit ones as possible because those are the ones that sell. The center ones don't. Broadstone is having trouble selling the center ones, and so is Old Ivy to the south. And in this particular unit, we're putting 40% as center units. Those center units may turn into rentals, and we all know the issues that come with rentals. That is not what is meant for this single-family neighborhood. We request that the commission in the neighborhood, of which there are 50 homes now in there, that will be impacted and affected by the decisions that you make. If we turn this into multi-housing, that we strive very carefully to keep those on the outside and not come into, then that opens the door and sets a precedent, not only for this neighborhood, but for other neighborhoods throughout the city of Provo, that we lose their identity and lose their single-familyness. Those are the concerns that this neighborhood has with regards to this development. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. Hello?
Hello, this is David Horn. My address is at 65 East on 3900 North. I live about 40 to 50 feet. My driveway actually is about 30 feet from the corner of this proposed development and property. I lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and raised my kids in the neighborhood around the corner. I moved to Farmington and moved back specifically to come back into a single family neighborhood where I raised my kids. And based on the last meeting and all of the recommendations that were made to Mr. LaFontaine, I've only seen one address, and that's lower the density. Regardless of which direction those units face, whether they face to the east or whether they face to the north, I'm looking at what has been referred to as a barrack style look directly from my porch, which I expect to be able to sit on in the afternoon and the evenings. I was in favor of or appreciate Ms. Winder's comment of that view, and that directly affects me and my family. I am in favor of having a very low density to create that as a buffer zone. I had recommended previously in discussions that I would be in favor of 3 duplexes. I agree with the comments that were made with the center units. Don't have good occupancy. I wouldn't want, before we built here, we actually looked at the properties just on the north side of our wall at Broadstone, the HOA. The only units we were interested in were the end units. I didn't want to be squished in the middle. In Farmington, after we sold our home there and came here, we lived in an apartment complex. And a lot of those units, all those units, face outward to the street. And that's where people parked. So regardless of whether they have parking or not, people are going to park where their front door is. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horn.
There are no other callers at the moment.
Okay. Did you want to put a timer on that?
Okay.
All right. Are there still no other callers?
No other public comments at this time.
Okay. All right. I think we've received quite a few, so that's understandable at this point. I'd like to close this portion of the hearing to public comment then, and I would ask Mr. LaFontaine if there is anything he would like to respond to, and then I'll follow up with anything staff heard that they may want to respond to.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Jensen. So I think the zone change would simply provide a natural, consistent continuation of what has already been passed through the city, both north and south of me. The trajectory of this property was, different, but it's changed from what has been the zonings and changes that have happened on both sides of me, north and south. So I'm just I'm just asking for the same consideration. What is it? Kind of what is it that you would do if you were me? And so that's what I've gone after. There are some modifications that can be done to this plan, certainly, with the front 2 units facing 3900 North. But other than that, I just, I don't really have anything more to say. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any final questions for Mr. LaFontaine? Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, not so much a question, but just a comment. I appreciate the comments that we've received. For me, it's not so much a matter of how we get there relative to what the zone is or those types of things, but I absolutely think that 10 homes of this type on this property, as they've been described, and I don't know that they'll necessarily be $500,000, but anything close to that, with the right design, and I think that the applicant has acknowledged that the design needs to change, would be a great fit in any neighborhood. I'm kind of at my wit's end when it comes to hearing people complain about homes of this nature and how they might adversely impact their street or their neighborhood or their home or anything like that. I don't buy that at all. Given what's next door to this property to the south, and even I think that there are twin homes across the street to the north, if I remember right. 10 homes, I think, is a great fit. Frankly, I think 12 or 14 or 16 might be as well. I don't necessarily think that fewer homes makes the project any better, but I think it would be important for me to support the project, to have the applicant understand clearly that the design still requires some work, but I think we beat this thing to death. And from a land use perspective, it makes great sense. I am very concerned about the idea that, we kind of cut deals with neighbors and neighborhoods as we go through development review processes, and that's what recommendations are based on instead of just good policy. So that's definitely a concern for me about kind of the history that has been involved with development in the neighborhood. But this is really easy for me to support with the idea that the applicant's willing to make changes to the design.
Well, I would agree with what you've said, Mr. Anderson, except I would also add that I think it's important that should this proceed, that the applicant also enter into a development agreement with the city that would restrict the number of units that can be developed on the site, so that it not be at right, which would allow 15 units, but that it be restricted to the 10. And I would also, this is a concept site plan. So there is a lot of development that is yet to happen as that site plan is tweaked and as the elevations and the design of the units progresses. You can't expect at this stage of the game, when we're just asking for zoning and a concept plan approval, that you're going to have full-blown elevations and so on and so forth. And I'm hoping Mr. LaFontaine has listened to a lot of the suggestions he's heard from us and also from development services, how to make this better fit into the community and be a better product in the process. Any other comments, commissioners?
I had one.
Ms. Jensen.
I agree with what you and Mr. Anderson have both said, except for I think it needs to be stepped down one notch. I know that, like, in theory, it makes sense to have as many units there, but if we truly are trying to make it a buffer zone between the two developments, I feel like it has to be somewhere in between. I don't think it needs to be as low as very low density, but I think 9 units instead of 10 would just step it down a notch and give it more of a single family feel, less of a packed in houses feel. but that's just my opinion. My other question, maybe for staff, is because so many people were concerned about the design, and even though this is concept plan, could you maybe tell us, to reassure us and the neighbors, what design guidelines this project plan would have to meet so that they could foresee, if this was approved, what that would look like?
Yeah. Anybody can go to the code 1434-287. We have some pretty specific design standards for our multifamily zones. So the LDR is included in that. And those design standards would be put against whatever plans he brings forward in the design review committee and in the staff review for his project plan approval.
Can you go to the elevations? But understand that those design standards allow for fiber cement siding, or hardy board, hardy plank, it's also called. So those elevations, that building material, if that was hardy board, fiber cement siding, they could be built like that according to our design standards.
Thank you.
I'll just comment that it does make sense to me. I agree with Ms. Jensen that when we spoke last time, we talked about a buffer that was a step down from the density of old ivy. And I still think that that is preferable. I would like to see a design that looks like it belongs in a neighborhood with $1 million homes. And this doesn't quite get there for me. And the orientation of all of the, I just think the space could be adjusted even if the number of units doesn't go down. But I like that plaza aspect that Ms. Jensen talked about earlier. And I would have a hard time voting for this concept, although I don't have a problem voting to say that that this lot seems to fit some multifamily housing. But the way it's laid out does not fit the neighborhood to me. And I'd like to see something that when a plan were to come back, it would look significantly more like the other houses that are in the area.
I think one of the things that, and this is really for Mr. LaFontaine, one of the things that people are reacting negatively to are the quadruplex units, the 4 in a row. That the scale of that, it does not suit a residential neighborhood very well, or a single family residential neighborhood very well. And that perhaps, as Ms. Jensen was saying, breaking it down into 3 units instead of 4, there are a million ways you can work your site plan. And I'm sure you've been through several of them already. But the quadruplex it's kind of a relentless facade. And I've worked on buildings like this myself. So, I know that they're very large when they're built. They really are very large. And it might make your product more marketable if you broke those down into smaller increments. Instead of having 4 units gang together, maybe 3s and 2s. That's just my opinion.
I would agree with that.
I'd like to just make a comment and to address some of the letters that we received and also some of the comments that have been made here tonight. That I realize that when one moves into a neighborhood that there's a reasonable expectation that that things will always continue the way they are. So if you move into a neighborhood where there are many single-family homes, that it will always remain single-family homes. But Provo is growing, and this is both a blessing and a curse. It's bringing a lot of growing pains to Provo. And I've heard people on this particular issue, I've heard people comment, not tonight, but previously, that high density projects like this shouldn't happen in this area, but should only happen in downtown areas where there are already other high density projects. I think that this is the project itself, the idea is okay here. It is a buffer, and not everybody wants to live in a single family home, but they like the ambiance of a single family neighborhood. And they want to be a part of that neighborhood. They don't want the lawn care, but they want to be part of something long-term. You're not going to get short-term rentals at these places moving in here. Having said that, though, I think that in order to be attractive and entice the people that you want, you need to look at the homes in the neighborhood and design this project accordingly. I think that this current design, and I do realize it's just a rendering, I think this current design matches the character of the neighborhood. And I think that I really like Ms. Jensen's idea of grouping them in groups of 3, which will give the character of 3 very large single-family homes, as she mentioned, and give the appearance of single-family homes, but you still have the high density that you're after. I am in favor of having high density in this area, and so those are just my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Wenda. Any other comments, commissioners, or questions for staff or the applicant?
I think I have a question for the rest of the commission.
All right. Was there someone else before we go there?
Yeah. It was also me.
And was that to
Lisa? Lisa
the other
Jensen also has a
question for the applicant?
I just had something that I wanted to state, kind of like Ms. Winden just did, that some of the comments people made were, there's other places along busy streets. This is a neighborhood. We shouldn't have something here. And I just wanted to clarify to everyone that this is on one of the busiest streets in Provo. So their facade faces a neighborhood street, but this actually backs onto University Avenue. And just as an explanation to them, to help them understand why we consider this to be a good spot for this type of higher density development.
Excellent point. All right, Mr. Anderson.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and this might sound like it's not genuine, but it is. And maybe I'll say it this way. For example, I would be in favor of 12 homes on the property instead of 10. If it were 4 3-unit buildings that, and Deborah, you'll know what I'm trying to describe here. If they were like a mansion style,
right,
or a big house style, where they truly look like big single family homes, where
and
you don't
each of them has unique architecture instead of all being the same.
Certainly could. I would much prefer to see something like that I think could be much more consistent with the look and feel of the surrounding homes.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be willing to throw that out, with the idea that,
maybe a couple more homes there would be a carrot for the applicant to really go back to the drawing board on the design to try to do something that would just be much, much more fitting from a design perspective than anything we've seen so far.
Or you could have 5, all of them facing outward, and they were all duplexes.
There are many typologies of housing, and Mr. Anderson's suggestion of, they're called mansion homes. They're multi-unit buildings, but they look like mansion homes. They're very attractive. If the applicant's interested, there were many done at Stapleton when the Stapleton Airport was redeveloped. There's some areas in Stapleton that they call them mansion homes, and they're readily available online.
That's Stapleton. What state?
That's in Colorado. It was Stapleton Airport just outside Denver.
Okay, thank you.
There's some great examples there. So there are many ways to approach a site plan like this. I don't know that I would be in favor of adding 2 more units, only because I think the site's pretty constrained for parking and open space to make that happen.
It's really just a matter of design, though.
It really is, but I haven't seen any design come through, and this is the 3rd pass that starts to look at other typologies.
I think we should keep it at 10.
Again, I'm just trying to come up with some type of incentive for the applicant to
right, understood.
Obviously he doesn't have a zone change, so there should be plenty of incentive just at that. But I do think there are other styles of homes that the neighbors probably would be much more prone to embrace.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is that something that would keep us from talking about making these recommendations today? I feel like that's something still that would come in the project plan phase, right?
Staff, you want to address that?
Well, you're talking about a lot of design suggestions that we couldn't require if the zoning was in place, because you could meet the LDR zone and the design guidelines that go with that zone without doing any of the things that you're suggesting.
So what would help to improve that, the likelihood of that happening then?
If you want to encourage design changes, that's got to be done prior to zoning being granted, or your ability to encourage those changes goes away.
So at this concept plan, those changes need to happen.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
May I ask you, Mr. Pepperoni, should the zoning be approved with a development agreement stipulation this evening by us and go on to council? Are we obligated to approve the concept site plan as well? Or would we have any ability to influence the concept site plan once the zoning's passed?
Once the zoning is in place, your ability to affect the concept site plan goes way down. So the plan that you see in front of you tonight, if the zoning were in place, Mr. LaFontaine could go forward with that plan.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Jensen?
Yes, Ms. Wyndham.
I have a question. Mr. LaFontaine, some of these ideas that have been floated, do they appeal to you at all? Are they something that you feel like you'd like to follow up on them? Or do you think that you just want to stick with the concept plan that you've proposed?
I don't even know how to answer that, because there's, you guys have great ideas. I mean, there's a lot of different concepts that can be come up with, and I mean, they would be never ending, I almost believe. So, I mean, am I willing? Of course I'm willing. I'm trying to do something with my property here. So I'm not going to tell you no. And this is my third stab at it. So, I mean, we could come back with another plan another day and go from there, I guess. But I don't, like I said, I'm not sure how to answer your question. We put a lot of thought and effort into this with the planning staff. And like I said, I mean, I don't think it's going to ever please everybody. You guys have had some great comments and ideas. I kind of going back to the one, I think that was Mrs. Jensen, of turning numbers 1 and 8 facing towards 3900 North. That's a pretty easy fix. Otherwise, it's going to be a total and complete rebuild on everything for this property. So.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioners, where are we?
Well, the more that we talk about it and the more that I think about it, I think we kind of owe something to the applicant in terms of making a recommendation on this and letting it run its course with the council. I'd love to give him a reason to consider overhauling the design, going back to square one. And again, for me, that the number of units, I think, is a terrible judge of quality and appropriateness and that type of thing. I think there are other things that I'd much rather hang my hat on than that. So I'd be in favor of, at this point, just making a recommendation, moving on to the council, or continuing it to give him a chance to go back to the drawing board. And if he could propose a design that's significantly better than this, and it has 11, 12 homes in it or something like that, then I'd love to consider that.
I think that it's, from what we've talked about tonight, it sounds like if he came back with a design where all the units were facing the street, where there was a community, behind the homes, and the same density as what he's already got, 10 units, but each of them looks like a unique house in this neighborhood, I think the neighbors would be happier. I think the design would fit in with the neighborhood, and I think he's more likely to get what he wants for the selling price he's hoping to get. But I'm not, if it really does make it so we can't talk about design more before this goes on, I don't think it's a good idea to send anything to the council.
I agree with that. I am very comfortable with a zoning change. I am not at all comfortable with the concept site plan at this point. And if approving the zoning means approving the concept site plan, I can't vote for it today.
Same here.
Same here.
I don't have a problem with the zoning as long as there's a development agreement in place. Given
that
that limits to 10 units, given that this is the site plan that's being presented. I do think if the design guidelines allow for the types of elevations we just saw, then the design guidelines need to be revisited. And that would be a recommendation to development services that at some point we revisit those design standards and tighten them up so that we have better quality architectural solutions to some of these site plans. That's where I sit right now.
I think that our reasoning for being comfortable with having a higher density is simply because we know it's possible for the design to fit in based on what we've seen in other areas. But I think the design standards don't automatically require that, because that's not a one-size-fits-all situation. I think design standards are probably minimal for that reason. But in this case, if we really want to say high density is appropriate here, then high density here needs to look like it belongs here. especially with that price tag.
Yes. I have a question for Mr. Pepperoni. I'm wondering if we said yes on the zone, but no on the concept site plan, what happens?
Goes on to city council, and if the city council approves the zoning, then they would come back to you for project plan approval.
They wouldn't have to come back for a concept site plan?
No, they could proceed to project plan if they had their zoning. If the zoning was approved by the city council.
Okay. Good to know.
Can you put a whole bunch of conditions on a concept site plan so we basically have designed it ourselves? Is that even legal?
Well, you could see if Mr. LaFontaine is amenable to putting some of those types of stipulations into the development agreement.
I just hate to make it take more time when we know what we're trying to get at. But if there's no way to have guarantees of what it will look like, then I don't know that anyone will be happy with that agreement.
So can I make a comment here?
Mr. LaFontaine, please.
Thank you. So with what Mr. Pepperoni said there, and I have mentioned this before, you know, the two stipulations of units 1 and 8 looking or having those two units entering or the front door, which would look like the faces of the rest of these to face towards 3900 North. That would make the one unit that Mrs. Jensen was talking about, the one on the very east end of the property, would look like a 3 unit instead of a 4 unit. So that's, I mean, those are stipulations I would agree to. And then if not, I think probably I would have to redo the whole thing, which at that point, you know, maybe it makes better sense for me. Maybe I would go back to making something more aesthetically pleasing with 12 units instead of 10. The 10 units, as you know, from the last meeting, you were saying, well, let's get it close to the same density as the developments, you know, to the south of and north of me. So, you know, I just was trying to work with everybody on this. I know it's your decision, but that's just a comment I had.
Thank you.
I think we've kind of all decided that we don't think that just turning those 1 and 8 outwardly is going to solve the problem, because there's still a giant alley there and a giant building, whether the doors are facing one way or the other, there's still a giant building there. So yes, the facade looks better, but I don't think it really solves the major problem.
And I think that the interpretation of our last discussion has been maybe shaded a little bit. We talked about a buffer zone in between Old Navy and the rest of the neighborhood, with the concept of it actually being less dense than Old Ivy, not Old Navy. But
dang, I was going to get some jeans.
Yeah. So I don't think duplicating Old Ivy on this lot is a good idea. I do think higher density, but very elegant looking home makes sense. I really don't like the 5, 6, 7, 8. I dislike that intensely. I think the other parts could be worked with if those were not, if it just wasn't that huge block duplicated twice. So that's really my sticking point, is that it just doesn't fit. It's like putting Old Ivy in another area.
I think we're looking at something that's more like the twin homes and the three unit homes that are to the north. That's a true buffer zone, right?
Yes.
North of 39, like on 3960 north. that feels more like the character of the single family neighborhood.
Well, keep in mind, we can relay many ideas on how to crack this nut, but they all have implications for the bottom line of the property owner and the development expense. When you start talking about more smaller buildings, we're talking about an increase in foundation costs and exterior siding and all of those good things. So it has an implication for what is possible in terms of development. I don't know where to draw that line in this project, but there is a line. We could argue how to design the site probably for 2 weeks straight. So I think what we need to focus on tonight is whether we're comfortable with approving a zoning change with, or recommending a zoning change approval with development agreement of some sort, or not. I think that's the big decision to be made this evening, because we know if once the zoning's approved, then we don't have a lot of sway over what happens on the site in terms of how those buildings are situated, the kind of cladding that's used. I mean, it will go through another process with development services, but.
Madam Chair, can I?
Yes, Mr. Anderson.
This is maybe part question, part suggestion, but, and I do not want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I've heard at least several of us say that we're comfortable with 10 homes, the land use, let's say. I think we're also on the same page in terms of not being comfortable with the concept. I wonder if there's any value in separating the concept plan from the zone change and leaving the zone change where it is, continuing that and having that not move on to the city council, but having the council consider the concept to, give some feedback on that, so that the applicant, would have some idea as to how they feel about the land use and so forth before maybe the applicant spend more money on redesigning things.
I'm not quite certain I understand what you're suggesting we do.
Let the council chew on the concept without the zone change. Give the applicant some feedback if they're comfortable with the idea of having 10 homes here. Then the applicant, basically what I'm saying is, I think it's time for the applicant to get an audience with the council. I'm not sure that I'm comfortable moving the zone change forward without some pretty strong assurances that the architecture is going to get significantly adjusted. So that's what I'm trying to do is get the council into the loop. They may, the idea may be a non-starter with them, right? So all the time and effort that we have spent or would continue to spend with the applicant would be a waste of both our time and his. That's
so what I'm hearing you say is continue item 2, but forward item 3.
That is a perfect way to say it. Thank you.
The problem is that item 3 doesn't go to the council. That's ours to make a decision.
That's right.
Gotcha. I wonder if they would give some airtime to it nonetheless.
Mr. Pepperoni, would you weigh in on that for us, please? Or Mr. Ardmore?
That's such a unique suggestion that I haven't seen the council deal with that before, so it's hard to know. My guess is that if the planning commission were to do that, what the council would really weigh in on is the zoning.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're used to dealing with, the zone changes, which may be valuable for Mr. LaFontaine to get an idea if the city council is open-minded to a zone change. But I've never seen them discuss an administrative item without the legislative item being right there with it.
Yeah.
So when we when the project plan comes before us, we do have some sort of power over the design simply because we can say yes or no, right?
No,
How does that look then?
because if they meet the requirements of the zone, you can say yes or yes.
Okay.
And
What
to
if we were-
Ms. Jensen's point about the design guidelines, the staff was very willing to take any input the planning commission would give us on any of our ordinances and where we could improve them. We did fairly recently tighten up these design guidelines, and we're actually right now getting pushback from the Home Builders Association because we've tightened them too much. And the Home Builders Association is talking about bringing in their own amendments to loosen them back up.
You can't please everyone, can you?
I actually don't think that the designs here really don't fit into the neighborhood. If each house was a different color and a slightly different design, the hardy board and the rock, I think that's still, you would find houses that look like that in that neighborhood. I don't really think it would be that out of character. I think the out of character is that it's a giant fourplex. And so even though it kind of looks like a giant a house that would fit in the neighborhood, it's just, they're all the same. Did I interrupt you, Mr. Pepperoni?
No, I was finished.
Yeah, the massing's not broken down. That's, I think, what everyone's reacting to.
So could we say we approve the concept site plan as long as what's brought before you has all units facing the street and is no more than 10 units? So that it creates a plaza.
We need to be put in the development agreement.
But is that fair or is that unreasonable?
That's up to the applicant.
Mr. LaFontaine, what do you think?
I'm not sure how I could get every single unit facing either 3900 North or, what is that, 75 or 50 East?
70 East.
70 East?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, I don't know how that would even work.
And still have
If
access.
If you broke them down into threes, I think you could.
If there were 9, it would work, but
okay,
with 10, it's hard.
Yeah. I should have just given this to you guys to design for me.
Oh, no.
We've been working on this really hard.
You get what you pay for.
So, yeah, I don't even know how to comment to that. I don't think that would work if you faced every one of them outside to those two streets. I don't know how you would access for parking or anything else inside.
And still meet your setback requirements.
Yeah.
What if you had a threeplex facing east, a threeplex where units 1 and 8 are facing north, and then you had another twoplex on that back side to the left of where you now have your pickleball court. So everything kind of shifts a little bit to the right and puts another duplex in the backside.
Yeah, but what's going to be the front of the duplex? You're going to have the back.
The wall.
You're losing your visitor parking.
That's true, because it doesn't really face University Avenue, does it?
No.
I could see how it would work with 9, but I don't know what to tell you. I think that's what's keeping us. It's that alleyway between the 2 4s. It's the giant facade of the 4s. If we could figure out how to get these buildings reoriented.
But the giant facades of the 4s, they both get broken up if you're facing units 1 and 8 towards 3900 North. So it breaks that up completely.
It doesn't get rid of that alleyway, though.
No, it doesn't.
And still on the east side, it's still a giant house. Even though the door is facing a different direction, it's still a giant looking building.
Yeah, it would look like the big mansion homes that were discussed earlier. So, I mean, that could be changed so it does look more like a mansion type house, but so you would have the 3 the 3 units that are facing 70 East. So that is one way of doing it.
What if you took number 8 off and put it over next to number 9, so that they're not all the same size in a row, so that the alley is buffered a little bit by the fact that it's not the same ending point?
Well, because there has to be enough access to get in and out to get to those units 5 through 8, and also, you know, the additional parking and the
to block his access.
pickleball.
Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't. And we did look at that, but we couldn't make it work.
Then
Honestly, Mr. LaFontaine, I think some of the reactions to the architectural elements of your elevations, you know, right now you're just showing board and batten hardy board along the whole thing. I mean, you could start to break down that scale by using instead maybe shake shingle hardy board in the gables. There's all kinds of architectural, some banding, things that will break it up a bit.
Certainly, and that's where, you know, you could also add some stone on the bottom and then have some awnings coming out, or I don't know if you want to call them awnings. I think of canvas, but that's not, I'm thinking
like a porch or a stoop or
something.
If you divided up the fourplexes so that 2 of the units were one color and design and the other 2 were another, even though they were attached, it might bring it down and not make it look so huge.
Yeah, I'm certainly want the zone change, and in addition to that, I want good-looking buildings. I don't know if any of you saw the initial one that we came up with. It was a contemporary design, which we really liked, which apparently didn't fit the neighborhood, so we changed it from that. So going in and doing some of these suggestions, you know, of the sidings and changing those things up and putting in awnings and those types of things, those dress up a building. I think they'd look great.
So, Mr. LaFontaine, if you put 7 and 8 with 9 and 10, so that you had those facing, you wouldn't need 2 driveways.
I think he might need 2 accesses legally.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. You guys are deep.
Well,
I think we've.
you might actually be able to eliminate that. Well, yeah, if you need, never mind. We could redesign this for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
There's so many options. So,
you know what I do like about that is if you moved 7 and 8 over and just had that one driveway, I haven't heard anyone affirm that that's illegal. Then everything accesses the same parking lot instead of having the visitor parking not even close to those other units. So everything would be connected. That would be that would help it be more like the plaza we were hoping to get out of reorienting them.
Yes. And the other idea I have is that if the second driveway were on the west side of the property instead of in the middle, that also would give you a larger space in the middle to work with.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's, I mean, I think that there are things that could be done. I can't say yes to the way it is now. And I'd like to be able to say yes.
does anybody want to try to take a stab at a motion? Whether you're in favor or opposed?
I could make a motion here.
All right, Ms. Jensen.
Let me get I move that we continue items number 1 and number 2, or excuse me, number 2 and number 3. Daniel LaFontaine requests a zone change from R110 to low density residential for 1.07 acres for a townhome development located at 50 East, 3900 North at the River Bottoms neighborhood. And also requesting concept plan approval for 10 townhomes in a proposed low density residential zone. Pending a concept plan that shows us a layout that is more conducive to the neighborhood style. How was that?
Anyone have comments?
I second it.
Do we
Seconded by Mr.
need to tweak the wording, or did that seem like it covered our concerns?
I think that gives us plenty of latitude going forward to work with the applicant on all the things we've talked about. I like that.
All right, so we have a motion from Ms. Jensen and a second from Mr. Anderson to continue items 2 and 3. Are we good with that? Are we ready to vote?
I guess maybe just to make sure that Mr. LaFontaine knows that we feel like the low density residential is a good use of this land, and all we're waiting for is the right layout that makes it fit in with the area that it's in.
Understood.
All right,
We're
commissioners.
out playing soccer with those kids right now.
I think Dave's at a baseball game.
All right, commissioners, we have Ms. Jensen's motion. And that was seconded by Ms. Wyndon, correct?
Mr. Anderson.
Anderson.
Mr. Anderson, sorry, I can't keep everybody straight.
They
I'll
sound
take
the
a
same.
vote then. I'll take a vote of the commissioners. Mr. Knudsen,
Remind us what we're voting for, just so that in case he doesn't know.
this is to continue items 2 and number 3 until we have an improved concept plan as discussed with the applicant this evening.
Maybe he's
So,
gone.
Mr. Knudsen? Development Services, is Mr. Knudsen still with you? The microphone's muted.
Apparently they're having technical difficulties.
All right, I'll come back to Mr. Knudsen. Ms. Jensen?
Aye.
Mr. Phillips?
Aye.
Mr. Anderson?
Aye.
Ms. Wyndon?
Aye.
Ms. Urquiaga?
Aye.
Mr. Knudsen?
Aye.
Thank you. And Ms. Jensen, aye as well. So we will continue items 2 and 3, and we would ask Mr. Fontaine to come back with those items that we requested in that motion. Right.
Can I make a request? Maybe. I'm just asking.
Mr. LaFontaine, please.
Yeah, thank you. There's been a lot of ideas, and so is there some way that I can get I didn't get everything drawn up. So is there some way that can happen where I can at least have your suggestions maybe emailed to me? Nothing, you can scan it in, just draw it on a paper. But.
I will try to detail those in my report of action, which you'll get a
Oh,
copy of.
okay, great. All right. That's good then.
Thank you, Mr. Ardmore.
Mr. Ardmore, do you understand the visual of I think it was Miss Wyndon's suggestion to move the units over so that the fourplex was facing north?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, just making sure.
Great. All right, commissioners, do we have a motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
I second.
Pardon?
I second, Ms. Urquiaga.
Second by Ms. Urquiaga. All those in favor, and I won't go through the roll call, just raise your hand and say
aye.
And bye.
Great. Thanks so
Bye.
much for your for your work this evening, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.